Well, everyone, the iPad mini 2 is one of those iPads that Apple released a couple of years ago, actually many years ago, and funny enough, this was one of the first tablets that I ever reviewed on this channel, and I love looking back and, taking a look at these iPads because every time I look at it, it seems like it changes, and it makes me feel like a young little man again, which is so crazy. Now, with the iPad mini's second generation, there's really no point in buying this iPad anymore. It makes so much more sense to buy the 6th generation iPad mini that just came out, so that makes way more sense to me, and it pretty much would be the only iPad I would recommend buying. So in this sense, at least the only iPad mini I would recommend buying. So in this case, I wouldn't recommend buying the iPad mini 2 anymore, but that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge and kind of appreciate what this iPad brought at that time. So in terms of that, that's pretty much the whole spoiler. If you want to buy the iPad mini 6 or maybe even the iPad mini 5, links will be down in the description. You can get it from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now looking on the outside of this iPad, you can see we have a 7.9-inch IPS panel on the front, and it's 1536 by 2048. And here's the craziest thing about this iPad. It's actually, not really an outdated design. When I actually look at this iPad and I look at, the iPad 9th generation or even the iPad mini 5 that Apple was still selling just like a couple months ago, it really doesn't look that outdated. I mean, it definitely looks dated, but it doesn't seem like it's the most outdated, device of all time. We've kind of gotten used to this type of, design, and I think that's totally cool. I'm still surprised how great of a job Apple did at this time, at that time, but it's not really worth it in terms of now. They took a long time to actually change the design of this thing, which actually kind of hindered the iPad mini lineup, I think, because the mini 4, they didn't, update for many years until the mini 5, and now the mini 6 is really good. So that's kind of a long-winded way to say the design of this iPad is pretty good for how old it is. On the bottom, we have a lightning port, which still looks, good. Headphone jack in this iPad as well. And on the back, we have the full aluminum back on this thing too, which I think still looks great. I don't really have too many complaints about it. And like I mentioned before, when you're getting an iPad like this, you're not really getting like a very outdated device. It's still a very good looking iPad, and I'm still a huge fan of it for sure. Now, in terms of the cameras, we have a single 5 megapixel camera on the back, and we have a 1.2 megapixel camera on the front. Now, there really isn't a point of kind of talking about this camera for 45 minutes, but, on the back, you can do 1080p videos, which I think is great. You have that capability there, which is really awesome. On the front, you have a 1.2 megapixel 720p camera. So really the only reason I would even recommend using this camera is if you want to do things like FaceTime call people and different things like that. But other than that, it just really doesn't make too much sense to use this camera. I know back in the day, people used iPads specifically for like taking Snapchats and like editing those Snapchats on an iPad because they can draw on it and everything. Since then, it really doesn't make too much sense to go ahead and use it, to be honest, because of those things, because you can do the same exact thing with your iPhone now, which is crazy. So I really wouldn't recommend using this camera as an everyday camera. I think an iPhone 6 camera is better than this one. So again, take it as you will. But this iPad camera we're lucky it has a camera. I think that's the best way to put it. We're lucky this thing has a camera that we can take videos and photos on, but I really wouldn't recommend using it other than that. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Now in terms of the longevity of this iPad, most of you probably already know this, but this iPad is pretty much outdated, and it has been outdated for a couple of years now. So it's not going to be getting any more software support. It's not going to be getting security updates. It's pretty much over with, so there's really no point in picking it up, even more so because of that. Now, I think iOS 12, which is what this iPad ended off with, is, I think it was a decent ending point. I think iOS 12 was pretty stable for the most part, but as I mentioned before, when you kind of when you're kind of going down this road of this specific software, it's really not going to be a good idea to actually pick it up. Again, mostly because it's already outdated with software and it's not getting any more software updates or anything like that. So it really doesn't make too much sense to go ahead and pick this thing up anymore, in my opinion. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. Now in terms of the performance, this iPad has that Apple A7 chip inside of it with 1 GB of RAM. And as I mentioned before, this iPad isn't really that great of an iPad anymore in terms of performance. Now surprisingly, it's actually not like super bad. And this is what kind of surprises me sometimes, is that when you have an iPad like this, it's still kind of smooth, it still kind of gets the job done, but it just doesn't really make too much sense to go and pick it up. As I mentioned, this type of iPad, it's already outdated in terms of software. It's already outdated in terms of everything else. And because of those things, you just kind of get an outdated, performing machine too. And that's kind of unfortunate because I feel like this iPad could probably handle, a lot of different things, in this day and age, but you're not really getting that type of iPad anymore. I used to use this iPad a little bit, back when I had it, and I pretty much only used it specifically for writing notes. And even that was kind of a chore because and this was a couple of years ago, and this was probably when this iPad was still kind of somewhat relevant. And even at that point, it just really wasn't getting the job done for me. It was just very slow. And some apps, at that point, a lot of apps were still supported, which was good, but it was just kind of a slow device. But nowadays we're having a completely different problem where this iPad is actually not even going to be getting application support much longer either. So there's going to be a time somewhere in the near future where an iPad like this may not even get, the next version of the software for an application. And that's going to be annoying. Imagine getting, having an update for your school, application or something, and you can't even update your app. That would be really unfortunate. And that's a very common occurrence. You would not believe how often that happens. So in this case, something like that could happen too. And I would hate for you to be in that situation. So in terms of that kind of covers up the performance. I probably wouldn't recommend picking it up from a performance standpoint. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this iPad has that 6,470 milliamp battery. And, this was probably one of the better things about this iPad. It was a pretty decent sized battery at that point. But like I mentioned, with this iPad, it's already outdated. And because of that, you're already getting a degraded battery as well. This, iPad is turning 9 years old this year. And with any device, it's not just Apple products, but with any device out there, you tend to get battery degradation, which is totally okay. Like I mentioned, it happens every single time with every single device, but it's still a very annoying thing that, you kind of have to deal with. So because of that, it makes even less sense to go and buy this iPad anymore, because you could potentially be getting an iPad that is pretty much outdated, and it just doesn't make too much sense because the iPad not only is outdated, but it also has degraded battery as well. So big, massive things to keep in mind, and that's pretty much the main thing to keep in mind in this standpoint. So in terms of that covers it up there. And ultimately, it just doesn't really make too much sense to buy the iPad mini 2nd generation anymore. Like I mentioned, it makes so much more sense to buy something like the iPad mini 5 or the iPad mini 6. The mini 6 I think is perfect. It's a little bit more expensive than a lot of iPads. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's still one of the cheapest iPads you can actually buy, in terms of going into the Apple Store and buying an iPad there. So that is a big, massive thing to keep in mind. Like I mentioned, you don't want to go and buy an iPad and already have it outdated, and that's exactly what you're getting with this type of iPad. I think it was something like the iPad mini 2nd generation. This thing is outdated, the iPad mini 3, and that thing is outdated, the iPad mini 4, and that thing is outdated as well. The only ones I would even slightly recommend are the mini 5 and mini 6, and the mini 5 makes complete sense to me. The mini 6 makes even more sense to me. I mean, that thing is like a perfect iPad. Unfortunately, with the iPad mini 2, it had its time, but unfortunately, it's not really at its time anymore. And I probably would not recommend buying this thing anymore, to be honest. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.